Welcome to Powered by Ancestry. I'm your guide, Kwesi Kunadu. In this episode, we'll focus on historians, history, and ancestry. That is, how do historians like myself go about the work of digging deeply into history as well as family history in order to learn more about ancestry? The historian has a set of tools that are very important to the task of ancestry. The most important tool is curiosity. For those of you that saw the intro episode to Powered by Ancestry, you might recall the video and some discussion about Alex Haley's roots. Haley talked about curiosity, and we can never underestimate how much curiosity helps to guide as well as navigate you through the frustrations, the dead ends, as well as the gems and finds that you will discover on your journey. And so curiosity is what we refer to as habit of mind. That is, we have to have certain habits of the mind to help us work our way through much of the documents and other records and oral histories and sources, which I'll share with you in a moment to get you on your way. And so if curiosity is one of the most important tools and attitudes or habits of mind, what are others? Another important habit of mind is distance. You want to have enough distance whereby you and I do not become the lawyers for people before us. Our job is not to adjudicate or to try their case or to judge their experiences. That's not our job. We are not the lawyers of our ancestors. What we're there to do is to dig up, to discover, and to put those pieces in place, put them in context along a timeline so that our story, our package, becomes more intelligible, becomes more clearer, and makes more sense. Again, some amount of distance to say that we are visiting the past. Another tool that we can use is the tool of interpretation. So once we come across a record, whether that be a baptismal record, a census record, or another document, or another source, we have to get to the task of interpretation. We have to make sense of it. Question is, how do we make sense of it? The historians have a particular way of going about interpretation. Historians need more than one source to corroborate, essentially to not only verify, but to make sense of a single source. So for example, let's say you hear one story from an aunt or an uncle or grandparent that you interviewed. You want to also make sure you interview other relatives. And what you're looking for is consistency. Not sameness, but consistency. Patterns, if you will. And those patterns will give you clues upon where to look elsewhere, or where to look more, or what kinds of questions to ask as follow-up. One person's word doesn't do it, even though one person may provide a gem or insight that can lead to other meaningful questions or can lead to other significant finds. And so we need to have a bit of corroboration. Let's say in the case of Alex Haley, he found tons of records according to his own account. However, a year or two after his book was published, Haley faced not one, but two lawsuits. For what, you might ask? Plagiarism. He had taken verbatim, or in part, other authors' work to put together his roots. And so what we don't want to do is to rely on shaky or uncorroborated information. All sources are problemsome. All sources have challenges. All sources have bias. All sources have their own interests. And so we have to always be mindful of these considerations when we think about a record or a source. And so when we come upon a family Bible, or we come upon a photo, or we come upon an art or artifact, got to think about, well, who created it and why? What was their interest? What was their bias? What could they know? What couldn't they know? Why did they create it? These are very important but essential questions for interpretation. Once we get to the process of interpretation, now we're looking at story creation and storytelling. We have to think about how do we essentially map out, how do we lay out all these sources, all these tidbits of information, all these fragments in a way that they can tell a somewhat coherent story about who we are as a package of our ancestry. To do this, I want to share with you step by step some of the major sources, and hopefully going through each step by step and then rounding them out will give you further guidance as to how to use the tools of the historian to the task of your ancestral and family history. Here are some of the major sources that I have used and that you will use as well. So, one of the categories of sources that you have or will come across are birth, marriage, and death certificates. So, for example, you may come across a marriage record for your grandmother who may be alive, or grandfather who may be alive. And that record will give you information about where and when they were born, also the date of their marriage, and perhaps who'd married them, and if there's any witnesses, they may be recorded as well. So that'll give you some details to extend your family tree and therefore mapping out members of your family. Birth certificates are also crucial. They give you also dates, and those dates become essentially points that we can plot out on a timeline. So we can build a chronology of your family history. And of course, death records provide you with dates that are important for having a beginning and end to a life. The next category here are registers. And these are for the enslaved. Particularly, as I've mentioned in previous episodes, the principal focus here is on African ancestry. And so these registers refer to those records that record usually the name, and these, of course, enslaved names, which vary, and we can talk about that more. But you'll find, nonetheless, the names of the enslaved and some of the legally emancipated. You'll find them as well. But mostly in these so-called slave registers, particularly in the Caribbean island, but in other parts of the Americas, you find these registers of the enslaved. You find names, you find relationships, for example, those who are married. You find the children of those who are married or not. You'll find their relative ages, and I say relative because ages were not a precise mark of documentation. And you'll find also inventories. And these inventories were created for taxation purposes. In other words, plantation owners would, for instance, have to supply the locality in which they operated inventories of chattel, because these enslaved people, according to the enslavers, not according to them, were property. They were things to be used, shared, and discarded. And so they had to be inventoried, much like you inventory your couch or your bed or your motorcycle or another object in your possession. And those inventories are used for valuation, meaning a certain value will be assigned to them for taxing purposes. And so inventories are useful because they provide, again, another record of names of individuals that can be traced with other records that are available. So let's say, for example, you are able to find birth certificates of individuals, let's say in the late 19th century or the mid 19th century, which in some cases are likely, especially in the Caribbean basin. And you're able to find names, of course, in registers, because you would find, for example, a certain religious organization, particularly Christian churches, would have birth and marriage certificates, which can then be combined with data from the registers and the inventories. All right. The next category of records, which you may not think will be applicable for the deep digging of ancestral research, but in fact, GPS software is becoming a very important tool. GPS software can be used to essentially map out data that is pulled from deeds and tax documents and other records. Why is this so important? Because here, especially during the period of chattel enslavement, formal chattel enslavement that is, you'll find that slave holders would in fact move from one locality to the next. So let's say, for example, let's say your ancestors have some rootedness in the state of Virginia. Slaveholders would in fact move to West Virginia or move further west into the Midwest. And so each time they move, and of course they resettle and they have a new property, that property would have to have a deed. And on that deed, by tracing the slaveholder and therefore his holdings or her holdings or both, you can look at the tax documents that can able to plot out, essentially those inventories for the new locations there. And if you plot out those points, you will see essentially a trail of migration. And this is deeply important because what you can do by mapping this data onto a GPS software, you can follow the path of a family's movement over time, which means now you can actually trace your ancestry geographically by going, let's say, to Mississippi or Alabama or even parts localities there to ask questions among people who have lived there for generations, and thereby find out more information about your family history. Another category, which is much more intimate to your family, are family Bibles. Some families will have family Bibles where they keep certain records, photos, and other documents in these Bibles. I've had, for example, students who've had family Bibles that go back to the late 18th century, and in them are genealogies. That is, listings of people who are their immediate and sometimes distant kinfolk. And so family Bibles are these almost personal or family archives that have these tidbits and fragments of information about family history tucked away in them. And of course, they call family Bibles because the Bibles were, in fact, again, the archive or repository for these fragments. So family Bibles, if they are available, and in some cases they are another important source for this ancestral history. Photos, where possible, usually black and white. In some cases, if a family was, reasonably resourced, they may have paintings or sketches or drawings. And so any of these visual or documentary records adds to the value of putting a face to a registry or putting a face, to a marriage or baptismal record. Family Bibles, photos, drawings, photographs, or original paintings within a family. Now, this is one of my favorite, oral histories. I've used oral histories among my aunts, my grandmother, my grandmother's sisters, and among my grandmother's brothers, as well as among distant relatives in the Akompong Maroon community in Jamaica, and also in my own work and family work in Ghana, West Africa. And oral histories are deeply important because they provide and use memory as a means to, again, capture data that can then be mapped on to GPS, mapped onto your timeline or chronology of your family history. And so oral histories are important. Now, they don't provide dates, but what's important here is that they provide, in my view, the material substance that can be placed onto a chronology. So again, they don't provide dates. They're not very good on dates, and that's because of human memory. Human memory tends to collapse time into memorable moments. And so because human memory doesn't assign events to, well, this occurred in 1918 or this occurred in 1827, human memory doesn't do that. Again, it collapses time, historical time, into memorable moments. And so what you do, you use those moments in combination with other data points to then lay out on your chronology, on your timeline for your family's history. In addition to that, local newspapers, where possible. Local newspapers in the Americas, United States included, started around the mid to late 18th century. So before then, you probably won't find much. But certainly from that point onward, local newspaper may have some details, and it may not be necessarily about members of your family, but it'll give you context, meaning what's happening in the locality that connects to stories that you've gathered about your families. You may find, for example, newspaper clippings in the locality about the Great Depression. And so your family might have spoke about their experience in the 1920s and early 30s. And so that allows you to get somewhat context, some clues as to the kind of life they lived and when and where they lived, through that life. So local newspapers become a very important source where available. And then, of course, we come to state, local, and national archives. So if you're in the United States, then, of course, the National Archive, which is in Maryland, and then, of course, you have the Library of Congress in D.C. or Washington, D.C. Those places can have a lot of records that speak to the locality in which your family have lived, either sporadically or over a period of time. National and state archives also give you a sense about some of the big pictures, some of the big events, some of the significant moments that, again, will give you texture or context for your particular family. And in some cases, they'll provide specific data, as in the case of Alex Haley, where he was able to find data about members of his family in the Library of Congress. The other category of sources that we want to tap are family-based stories, songs, proverbs, sayings. In particular, for those of African ancestry, non-standard English phrases and words. Those are deeply important. For instance, in the late 19th century, those persons of African and communities of African ancestry off the coast of Georgia and Florida, that is the Gullah Geechee Islands. Some of them spoke, quote unquote, half African, which means many of their words and phrases were not English words. And those African terminologies and words are really important kernels of information, actually deeply important kernels of information, because they can lead to a particular African cultural group by way of the African language that those words belong to. So for example, let's say a word is Mende, and those words in fact travel within the generations of your family, then that gives you essentially, or points to, a potential cultural history and a people to which you might belong. There are other words and phrases that also will do the same work for you. And so do not discount, but play up on, again, non-standard English words and phrases as really important pointers and clues to a family history that has some depth. But it also sayings and stories, as well as songs and proverbs and other kinds of information that comes from your family. So family-based stories are deeply, deeply important. In wrapping up these sources, think about this as well. And you won't find this in any genealogy workshop, these sources anyway, in a way that I'm discussing them and sharing them with you in terms of how to use them and maximize them as sources. Look at physical features in those stories, or look for, I should say, physical features in those stories, in all these records where they are available, particularly scars, markings, tattoos, body type. For example, members in your family, let's say a grandmother or a great aunt, may describe, their father or mother or both, or their grandmothers and grandfathers as being particularly short or as being particularly tall. That is important because, for instance, people who live in a tropical rainforest are typically short in stature in their body type. Why? Because the forest canopy is like, very large, collections of broccoli that provides a canopy or cover that blocks direct sunlight. It means that because you don't, or your ancestors did not have direct sunlight, and therefore they wouldn't have source of calcium because cows, they would die in the forest. It means that you don't have enough vitamin D, or they don't have enough vitamin D. And that deficiency means that they usually don't grow tall in stature. And so the forest environment usually have, this is across the world, wherever there are dense tropical forests, people live there, they tend to be short in stature. So that body type gives you a clue, a general ballpark clue for family history. Also, conversely, if a family tends to be tall, let's say all over 6 feet 3 or 4, men and women, then they probably came from a savanna region or open savanna grassland, because now they have direct access sunlight. More than likely, they'll eat from the cattle, that is the beef. They'll drink milk or use milk, and therefore they will have sources of calcium and direct sunlight, which of course, provides vitamin D. And so there is a biological clues that are tucked away in these kinds of body type, but also again in the markings. For example, you can't see this in the camera, but I have a marking on my face on my left cheek that I was born with, and comes to find out that my folks, the Kalam peoples in Ghana, West Africa, have the same markings as a sign of who they are and therefore who they're culturally not on their face. And so these markings are important. And so when a baby's born, look for those markings, because they usually refer to an ancestor who had those markings. And so these markings, these scarifications, and these body types are also important clues for our family history digging. And finally, dreams. We're going to say dreams another episode, because dreams deserve their own episode, because there's so much there to unpack and so much there in terms of how to use them, how to record them, and much more. So we'll save them another time. As usual, I hope this episode has been helpful to you. Please share your comments in the comments section. For Powered by Ancestry, I am Kwesi Kunadu, your guide. See you next time.